Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Reports Weekly Cyber Report, sponsored by Northrop Grumman. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Joining us today is retired United States Navy Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, the Executive Director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission that recently issued 53 recommendations to improve the nation's overall cybersecurity. The panel was chaired by Maine Independent Senator Angus King and Wisconsin Republican Congressman Mike Gallagher. The Senate Homeland Security Committee convened remotely this week to hear from King and Gallagher, as well as two commissioners, former Department of Homeland Security Cyber Chief Susanna Spalding, as well as Tom Fanning, the chairman and CEO of the Southern Company, one of the nation's leading utilities. Admiral Montgomery, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Vago. It's a real pleasure to be here today.
You spent an enormous amount of time working and thinking about how China in particular was going to fight in the future to better prepare the United States Navy as well as the Joint Force for that fight. How did that background help you on this commission? And what advice do you have for anyone who's thinking about China and the kind of threat it poses to not just the United States military, but to the United States?
So that's a great question, because I think there's a lot of synergy between the threat we get from China or even Russia and the cyber threat. And I think what I learned most from my experience at the U.S. Pacific Command as the J3 was observing Chinese operations in the gray zone below the level of use of force. In other words, what they did to create conditions favorable to them that they knew would not engender a significant response from the administration. And so when you think about that, you think about their island building campaign in the South China Sea, how they very slowly and disingenuously, built these islands, claiming they were for search and rescue, not for military usage, built them up, violated the EEZ of numerous other South China Sea states, but in a way that they did it slowly and deliberately. And then after that, they were able to, they militarized the islands, slowly and deliberately. And they ended up with a significant advantage that even if it doesn't always influence the United States, it certainly influences the South China Sea littoral states, and was demonstrative that the United States was no longer the principal guarantee of security in the South China Sea, that there was a new significant power there in China. So there's slow gray zone operations. And cyber, it's the same thing. The things that really got under Senator McCain's skin and drove us to having this commission was the Chinese intellectual property theft over 10 to 12 years that resulted, according to the Blair Commission on intellectual property theft, and more than $1 trillion worth of loss over that period. Significant GDP affecting loss for the United States. And it was done just kind of at that level below which we were not going to take a significant action, military or punitive action against the Chinese. If you think about the Russian cyber-enabled IO information operations campaign against our 2016 elections, even as the Obama administration saw that in 2016, they felt handcuffed in their ability to respond demonstrably. And then you think about even the North Korean attack on Sony. In the end, even after we've done full attribution, I think we now have an indictment of one or two North Korean programmers. I mean, that is not the kind of significant responses that are going to change the adversary behavior. In fact, the adversary saw our lack of response as establishing a new norm where they could operate. So I think the shared learning there is that our adversaries have found that in operating against a democracy, in operating against a country whose true strength are its allies and partners, operating in the gray zone, where it's hard to attribute exactly what's happening, it's hard to identify explicitly the wrongdoing, is the way to successfully maneuver around us. And if you look at what Russia did in Crimea, it's the same thing. It was a little more blunt, but in the end, it didn't impact the U.S. national security interest. It was never a quote Russian invasion. It was little green men. So this kind of gray zone conflict is the way that adversaries have exploited the U.S. national security decision-making process and made things very challenging for us. So if I was back in the Pacific now, I would say we have to come up with more aggressive measures for dealing with how China operates there. And we have to more explicitly have declaratory policies that say, if you do X, we will do Y, and then we have to signal our willingness to do that. That's challenging, but it's the only. I think it's probably the best way to deter future action by an adversary and ensure that your interests are protected. And cyber would say the same thing. We need to begin to operate. We have a recommendation in the report about we fully validate and support these Department of Defense's Defend Forward strategy of more aggressively operating in the gray zone with the persistent engagement concept put forward by U.S. Cyber Command. But importantly, we differentiate. Our report says you have to expand this beyond the military. You have to integrate all the elements of American power. Our strongest element, our economic power. You have to integrate sanctions. You have to integrate our law enforcement capabilities, which are robust. You have to integrate our diplomatic activities, which are comprehensive. And if you bring economic, law enforcement, diplomatic, and military together in the gray zone and operate more aggressively, but in a way that signals your intent to not allow this inappropriate behavior by your adversary, then you could actually de-escalate the issue, ensure restore deterrence, and create a better national security environment for the United States. So from my point of view, that's the kind of synergy between cyber and China that I've seen.
But despite the fact that administration after administration, and certainly in a far more pronounced way during the Bush and Obama administrations about the need for having some sort of an integrated strategy, those strategies have not been integrated, in part for political reasons, in part because of business and corporate interests. I don't mean that in a negative way, right? I remember having this conversation some time ago with a very senior Republican member of Congress who thought that the kind of specific cyber guidance the Obama administration was initially thinking about was too much nanny state, and it's too restrictive, and it's too punitive and too cost imposing. How do you get people to do what it is we need done, given we just managed not to get there for a whole bunch of perhaps seemingly good reasons at the time, but we're not getting there?
So that's a fair point. What's changing that would cause the private sector to join the government in this effort? And I think the first thing I'd say is, as opposed to say Crimea or even the South China Sea, the victims of a lot of this cyber activity are in fact businesses. And what's happened is you can see good cybersecurity in U.S. businesses. You see it in financial services. You see it in telecommunications. You see it in some of the healthcare companies that hold a lot of your PII, your private information, your personal information. And the reason they do that is they've been victims of criminal behavior. They've been victims of this kind of these Chinese efforts to grab a lot of data. You see it in the hotel industry, who are under significant attack, in order to gain, by criminals and nation state actors. But that leaves a large portion of the economy, state and local governments, and a lot of small and medium-sized businesses that haven't experienced this. And the question you ask is a fair one: is that how do we convince those entities to participate in this process? And the answer is twofold. One, the adversaries helping us. Things like ransomware are now making criminal activity on what are traditionally non-financially beneficial programs. In other words, locking up a state or county's administrative servers, wouldn't give you cash normally, but the ransomware allows you to blackmail that organization, that state or county or locality, or you threaten to erase all their data, and therefore they can't collect water and utilities or taxes, or they lose judicial records, things like that. So that ransomware is introducing criminal behavior into a large amount of the economy where previously cyber criminal behavior wasn't cost effective. So the first thing I'd say is the adversary is making this easier. The second thing I'd say is that there's more, the Chinese behavior has created an unfair marketplace. And as a result, companies are beginning to experience the challenges that come from that unfair marketplace, and they're starting to recognize that this behavior is unacceptable, and they do have to take actions to either defend themselves or work with the government when the government's trying to build a collaborative environment. So it is challenging, but I think things are changing. That when integrated with the recommendations we have in this report, will give us can help us restore deterrence and ensure that the United States, the United States and its company and the companies that are located here have a level playing field in which to compete in the international environment.
Do you think that people's frustration with China, whether in a transatlantic or even a trans-Pacific context, given the source of the virus, how the Chinese mishandled it at first, the lying and obfuscation that went with it, as well as some of the really harsh rhetoric and bullying of nations around the world, give an opportunity to sort of hit the reset button and have a more concerted transatlantic, trans-Pacific cyber containment deterrence strategy toward the Chinese?
So I think that even prior to the pandemic, to the COVID-19 crisis, there was emerging a bipartisan understanding of the risk we were taking with a supply chain that was so dependent on Chinese production or development of products. And so there was starting to be recognized that the Chinese utilized their supply chain, for national security purposes, and that we put ourselves at significant risk as we became dependent on a supply chain that ran through China, particularly for goods that directly contribute to national security, but also more broadly for goods that contribute to the economic well-being of the United States. The pandemic crisis certainly highlighted some of the risks of a supply chain that ran through China, both in the initial response when it was hard to get items out of there, but then when you saw malicious behavior by the Chinese and how they utilized their ownership of the supply chain. And so I think this is driving us towards thinking about having an industrial strategy or an industrial policy to deal with the vulnerability that has grown up over the last 30 years. The first element of that is we have to determine what are our critical products and technologies that we need to have a guaranteed secure access to. And the second element is, once you've identified that list, determine where those are currently done. This doesn't have to be a US only solution. It can be a US plus allies plus partners. And the area we've been looking at, ICT, information communications technology, yes, China provides a lot of the products for the market, but so does Taiwan. So one of the issues we have to do is we have to decide, can we bring Taiwan into the secure environment? I think yes, and I think it's critical we do that. And I believe that it's critical that we work to ensure first that they have a secure, that they have a secure economic environment where we can ensure that products that come from there aren't susceptible to Chinese espionage. And then second, and compensation back to them, we continue to ensure their diplomatic and economic security as we're bound to by the Taiwan Relations Act. And so I think things like that, making sure that we're working with allies and partners to create that secure supply chain, are critical. And then long term, that's going to cost money. This kind of industrial strategy and policy isn't free, but on the other hand, it is freeing, and it will reduce these vulnerabilities. It'll create long-term national and economic security, and ensure that in a future crisis, whether it's a pandemic crisis, a cyber crisis, or some other kind of political diplomatic crisis, that the United States is not susceptible, and its allies and partners are not susceptible to Chinese manipulation.
Sir, thanks very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Vago. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DefAero Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. We'll see you again tomorrow.